The man in the Navy pilot uniform stood above her with a fury that didn't quite belong to the moment. Not yet. His voice sliced through the calm hum of the cabin, sharp enough to make the toddler in 10B flinch. "Wrong flight, loser," he snapped, his finger stiff and unwavering, pointed at the woman in seat 8A like it was a weapon, not a hand. Maya Collins blinked once, slowly, as if giving the universe a moment to reconsider. But it didn't. The man stayed there, jaw clenched, breath fast, while rows of curious faces leaned forward ever so slightly, not out of concern, but out of the same hunger people have when they see a stranger being humiliated in public. Half pity, half pleasure. She sat still, her spine barely touching the back of the seat, her hoodie stretched at the shoulders like it had lived through more than weather. A small, faded canvas bag rested on her lap, cradled in her hands like it was something delicate and irreplaceable. She wore glasses too big for her face and sneakers that had clearly walked farther than they were ever designed to go. The turbulence had been building for several minutes by then, sharp little shutters that turned the seatbelt signs from suggestion into gospel. Overhead compartments rattled with a sound that reminded some passengers of shopping carts rolling over gravel and reminded others of something they couldn't quite place but feared just the same. Maya hadn't said much. In fact, she'd only asked one question, spoken so gently the flight attendant nearly missed it. "Is the cabin pressure dropping?" The attendant, a young woman with perfectly looped blonde curls and a badge that said Jordan, offered a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am, please stay seated. Let the professionals handle it." From 2 rows back, someone chuckled. Low, derisive. A man in a sports jacket with gold cufflinks leaned toward his wife and muttered just loud enough, "She probably thinks she's in one of those spy movies." His wife, in her cream silk blouse, nodded solemnly, like it was tragic how some people still tried to pretend they mattered. Maya said nothing. She didn't even look their way. The pilot's voice returned, low and hot with frustration. "I said, this isn't your place. Whatever you think you are, this isn't the time to play expert." His voice was practiced, maybe too practiced, the kind that had told people off before, behind closed cockpit doors or in bars full of stories that started with, "Back when I was in command." But Maya wasn't rising to meet it. She didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She didn't fold into herself the way people often do when scorn finds them in front of an audience. Her face was still, soft, unreadable. She simply adjusted her glasses with one hand, her thumb brushing the worn edge of the frame like she was anchoring herself. From across the aisle, a man in a red tracksuit tilted his head and laughed, tapping his buddy. "Yo, what's she gonna do? Fly the plane with that bag of snacks?" Behind them, a woman in a blazer spoke up, her voice crisp and professional, the kind of tone people usually reserve for boardrooms and complaints to customer service. "Excuse me, can someone please ensure she stays in her seat? Some of us paid to feel secure on this flight, not whatever this is." A few heads nodded. Someone muttered, "Attention seeker." Another, "She doesn't even belong up here." And then someone said what many were already thinking. "She's just looking for attention." The cabin was no longer a place of travel. It had become a trial, and Maya was the defendant in a court of whispers and pointed fingers. The air, already thinning from turbulence, now felt thick with judgment, with fear looking for somewhere convenient to land. Still, Maya didn't move. She wasn't defending herself, wasn't explaining who she was or why her question had made people so uneasy. She simply folded her fingers around her bag again and let them mock her. Outside, the clouds churned in uneven swells, gray swallowing blue, the horizon flattening like something tired of holding itself together. And then, as the captain's voice cracked over the static-filled intercom with something halfway between desperation and hope, the entire cabin went still. "Viper 8, if you can hear this, the cockpit is waiting." And in that moment, no one laughed. Maya Collins had boarded Flight 4702 from San Francisco to Tokyo like anyone else. Quietly, ticket folded once and smoothed out again, the small canvas bag tucked beneath her arm as if it contained the only things that mattered. She walked with a kind of restraint that older people sometimes recognized, the kind that came from having lived long enough to know that attention was rarely a gift. And even less often was it kind. Seat AA was by the window. She'd asked for it, not because she liked the view, though once, a long time ago, she did, but because it allowed her to lean against something that didn't expect anything from her. She didn't make eye contact with the businesswoman in 8B or the aging hedge fund executive in 7C who glanced at her shoes and looked away with a subtle twitch of his mouth. She simply folded into the space, drawing her knees in slightly, and rested her hands on the frayed straps of her bag. She wore a slate-gray hoodie, faded at the cuffs, and denim jeans softened by age and repetition. Her sneakers, once white, were now something closer to weathered ash. Her hair was natural, loose and unstyled, framing a face that held no invitation. She looked like someone who knew silence better than speech, and perhaps liked it that way. The plane itself was modern, an international long-haul vessel outfitted with low blue light and touchscreen menus offering wine from Napa and soft jazz that looped beneath announcements. The front rows were occupied by the polished and the impatient, consultants with clipped voices, women in sharply tailored blazers, men with watches that announced worth before any handshake could. It was a quiet hierarchy, not spoken but felt. The line between who looked like they belonged up front and who didn't was drawn with the eyes. Quick glances, long stares, and polite dismissive smiles. Maya crossed that line by simply being there. The first time turbulence hit, it was small, a ripple more than a shake, but enough to make someone 3 rows back clutch her armrest like it might break loose. Maya didn't react. She blinked once, her fingers barely tightening on her bag. She had felt worse, much worse, and in places far less forgiving than a commercial airliner. Across the aisle, a teenage boy with wireless headphones and a YouTube hoodie sneaked glances at her, puzzled. She looked too calm. Not bored, not distracted, just calm, like the sort of calm that comes from having faced consequences more dangerous than a rerouted flight or a delayed landing. It unnerved people. The second jolt came sharper, more deliberate, as though the air itself was turning mean. Seatbelt signs dinged back on, and the captain's voice, smooth, male, vaguely southern, came over the speaker assuring everyone it was routine. The kind of routine that made flight attendants glance at each other too long before walking down the aisle with lips pressed into firm lines. That was when Maya had spoken, softly, almost to herself, but loud enough for the flight attendant to hear. "Is the pressure dropping?" It was not the words that made the woman pause, but the tone. Not fearful, not speculative, just certain. A question only someone trained would ask. But certainty, when delivered by the wrong person in the wrong uniform or no uniform at all, can sound like arrogance, and arrogance, when imagined in a woman wearing worn-out sneakers and a second-hand hoodie, is rarely forgiven. The attendant smiled tightly and moved on. The passengers did not. A woman in a navy pantsuit, scrolling through a spreadsheet on her tablet, made a small tisk sound, as if Maya had said something deeply inconvenient. The man beside her, salt and pepper hair and a Bluetooth earpiece still glowing, muttered, "Everyone thinks they're a damn expert." But Maya didn't explain herself. She never did. Not when they stared. Not when they laughed. Not when someone whispered, "She looks like she's never even flown before." She simply kept her hands folded on her bag and stared out the window. Not at the clouds, but past them, as if somewhere beneath the turbulence and noise, she was watching something only she could see. In that cabin of whispered judgments and curated privilege, Maya existed like a quiet contradiction. She didn't apologize for her presence. She didn't attempt to match their expectation of what competence should wear. She just sat there, waiting. Not for their approval, but for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. That moment was coming, and the storm outside was not the only one approaching. It began with a voice, sharp, feminine, manicured, in the way certain voices are when they've been taught that control equals power. "Excuse me," said the woman from 10C, her blazer perfectly pressed, her lips painted in a red that dared anyone to interrupt. "Can someone please ask her to stop making people nervous?" She didn't need to point. Everyone knew who she meant. The flight attendant, Jordan, turned on her heel and walked briskly toward Maya's row, her smile long gone, replaced by the strained professionalism of someone who had reached the edge of protocol. "Ma'am," she said, her tone clipped, "I need you to remain calm and refrain from commenting on technical issues. You're making some passengers uncomfortable." Maya looked up slowly, not startled, not defensive, just present. "I'm not the one shaking the plane," she said softly. Her words neither confrontational nor contrite, but factual in a way that unsettled. Jordan blinked, visibly thrown off, and murmured something about routine turbulence before stepping away with the awkward energy of someone realizing they had lost the upper hand, but refusing to admit it. Across the aisle, a man in his early 50s, balding, face flushed with indignation, leaned toward Maya and spoke with the kind of loud certainty that required no evidence. "Yeah, well, you don't exactly look like someone who should be talking about planes. Just sit back and let the real crew handle things." His wife, in a bright pink cardigan and pearls that clacked when she nodded, added in a syrupy tone that cut sharper than disdain, "Honey, you're meddling. This isn't the time to play hero. Just let the professionals do their job." Around them, the temperature of the cabin shifted, not literally but socially, as more passengers turned, drawn not by Maya's presence but by the growing consensus that she didn't belong. A few rows back, two young men in flashy athleisure leaned into the moment like it was entertainment. One smirked, his gold chain catching the overhead light. "She's gonna fly us to Narnia, huh?" The other laughed too loudly, nudging the seat in front of him. "She's probably a conspiracy nut. Watch her pull out a homemade parachute next." Their laughter was joined by others, a wave of derision that washed over row 8 with the cold, casual cruelty of people convinced they were right because the crowd agreed with them. Maya didn't respond. She didn't flinch or frown or fold in. She simply reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small, dough-geared notebook, opening it with the same care a pianist might give to an old sheet of music. Her fingers traced the page, not reading, not writing, just feeling. A woman across the aisle rolled her eyes, her voice loud enough for the cabin. "Oh great, she's got a diary. Maybe she's writing her Oscar speech." There was no violence in their words, no overt threat, just the steady erosion of dignity by 1,000 tiny dismissals. It wasn't the kind of hostility that could be reported or punished. It was worse. It was the kind that convinced others to join, to pile on, to nod along because silence felt too much like dissent. Then the oxygen masks dropped in the rear rows. Not all at once, but in an uneven stutter, like the system had to think twice before admitting something was wrong. Screams rose, not chaotic yet, but tight and rising. The plane shuddered hard enough to tip drinks, and a baby somewhere started crying, its wails thin and terrified. A man in a crisp white shirt stood abruptly, his voice booming over the growing panic. "This is ridiculous. Why is she still sitting there like she knows something? Someone get her away from the front. She's gonna make things worse." His anger became a permission slip. Others started murmuring. Some pointed. One woman near the emergency exit actually pressed the call button with so much force her knuckle went white. Maya remained seated. She didn't argue, didn't ask them to stop. She simply looked at the man who'd shouted, her eyes steady and still. And then, slowly, turned back toward the window, where the clouds outside rolled like bruises across the sky. Yeah, she wasn't trying to win. She was waiting. Waiting for something deeper than approval. Waiting for the moment when the people who had mocked her would realize they were not in control. Waiting for the truth to matter more than their comfort. And somewhere, just behind that silence, the storm crept closer. The third jolt wasn't sharp. It was slow, almost intimate, the kind of motion that made you aware not just of gravity, but of how delicately you were suspended above the world. It was the kind of shake that reminded old veterans of descent patterns gone wrong and made young children clutch their stuffed animals tighter, sensing that the adults no longer had all the answers. Maya closed her notebook and slipped it back into her canvas bag. The zipper rasped softly, but in the cabin's hush, it was a thunderclap. Across the aisle, the man in the red tracksuit who had earlier found his voice in laughter shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking between her and the overhead lights, which had begun to dim and flicker like a warning too polite to shout. He didn't say anything this time. His smirk faltered, not erased, but shaken, like a mask loosening at the edges. 2 rows back, a girl of about 9, her glasses slipping down her nose, looked at Maya not with suspicion, but with the cautious curiosity children reserve for people who act differently than expected. Her mother pulled her close, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of fear that too much curiosity could become dangerous. And then, through a hiss of static, the captain's voice cracked through the intercom. Not calm, not composed, but thin and frayed, like cloth pulled too tight for too long. Night Viper 8. If you can hear this, the cockpit is waiting. There was a second of stunned silence, the kind where time forgets to move. Somewhere someone whispered, "Did he just say Viper 8?" As if naming it aloud might make it real. Maya stood slowly, the movement fluid, deliberate, not an act of rebellion but of gravity, answering to something older than fear. Her canvas bag swung lightly against her hip. Her glasses caught the cabin's dim light. She did not speak, did not explain herself, did not ask for permission. Jordan, the flight attendant, stepped into the aisle, her mouth open, words forming and failing at the same time. For a brief moment, her eyes met Maya's, and in that flicker of silence between 2 women something shifted. The fear in Jordan's face softened, not into trust, not yet, but into something more dangerous to prejudice: curiosity. Maya passed the man in the crisp white shirt, the one who had demanded her removal minutes ago. He didn't stop her. His mouth opened, but the words that had come so easily earlier now caught somewhere between his chest and his pride. He looked away. The hedge fund executive said nothing, only crossed his arms tighter and tapped his phone, though the screen hadn't had signal in 20 minutes. The woman in the diamond earrings hissed under her breath, "This is insane," but her voice lacked its earlier edge, like a blade dulled by doubt. And yet it was not those voices that mattered now. It was the silence, the heavy, reluctant silence of people who had made up their minds and now watched them unravel. As Maya moved up the aisle, a young flight technician stepped from the cockpit, his face pale, his hands trembling. He looked barely 30, his uniform rumpled with sweat and urgency. "We need someone who understands terrain re-entry protocols," he said. Not to the crowd, but into the air itself, as if praying an answer would find him. "Cindy," the senior attendant pointed slowly. "She asked about cabin pressure before it dropped," she said, her voice quiet. Not a vote of confidence, but not condemnation either, just a fact. A thread of truth dangled in a sea of doubt. The technician's eyes met Maya's, and in that instant, something clicked. Not recognition, not quite, but instinct. That wordless sense soldiers and pilots share when they meet someone who has also stood at the edge. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "do you have aviation training?" Maya's response was simple. "Your altitude's drifting, 4 degrees, left axis." He didn't ask another question. He stepped aside. And Maya, who had been judged for her clothes, her silence, and the fact that she had dared to ask a question, walked past them all, not victorious, not vindicated, but necessary. Behind her, the red tracksuit man leaned forward, watching with narrowed eyes. His friend whispered, "What's she doing?" But he didn't laugh this time. He didn't even smile. He just stared. Because even in a storm, you can feel the wind change long before the sky begins to clear. The cockpit was dim, backlit by the muted orange of warning indicators, their blinking rhythm a silent metronome counting down to something no one in the room dared name. The captain sat rigid, his face slick with sweat, his jaw set like a man clenching a prayer between his teeth. He turned when Maya stepped in, his eyes scanning her face for something. Confirmation, explanation, maybe absolution, but whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. She didn't offer her name. Instead, she said, "Viper 8, requesting co-navigation clearance." Her voice low, almost hesitant, but carrying a gravity that softened the ambient panic, like a hand on a shoulder. It was not a request, not quite an order. Something older, simpler, and heavier than both. The captain froze. His gaze landed on her hands first, steady at her sides, then on her glasses, and finally her eyes. Calm, unflinching, bearing the strange stillness of someone who had lived through chaos and come out quieter, not louder. When he spoke, it was a whisper. Only one person ever used that call sign. Maya said nothing. He pointed to the co-pilot's chair. "We thought you disappeared after Oregon." She didn't respond, just slid into the seat like she had never left it, her body folding into the cockpit with a familiarity that could not be faked. Her bag dropped gently at her feet. She reached for the secondary controls, fingers moving with the kind of precision that doesn't come from training manuals, but from repetition. Repetition under fire, in low light, with lives hanging on every minor adjustment. "Pitch control system is feeding false data," she said. "Actual altitude is 800 feet higher than what's being shown." Her fingers brushed the navigation screen like she was reading a second language, one only she still remembered. The co-pilot hesitated, then nodded. His lips slightly parted in disbelief. He glanced at the captain, who didn't speak, didn't argue, just watched, his hand twitching near the throttle like he couldn't decide whether to intervene or let history take over. Then came the voice over the radio. Cold, bureaucratic, final. "This is control. No passengers are authorized to handle instrumentation. That is an order." The captain's hand moved toward the mic, his shoulders drawn with the weight of duty. But before he could respond, a voice cut through the cabin's speaker system. Gruff, familiar, commanding. It was the security officer. "I do not authorize someone scrubbed from defense systems to touch anything," he barked, like he could still undo what had already begun. Maya didn't flinch. Her hands paused on the control panel, then she turned, not to the radio but to the captain. "Then start calling rescue," she said, her tone even, unyielding. "Because we'll be retrieving bodies, not survivors." The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. The co-pilot broke it. "I'll sign off, let her take over." The captain gave a single nod, his voice low. "Go." Maya adjusted the seat, pulling it into position, slipping the headset over her ears with such ease it looked like muscle memory. She didn't check her reflection. She didn't ask for a checklist. Her hands moved as though the controls had been waiting for her. Outside, the Kamchatka Range rose into view, its jagged silhouettes like the ribs of the earth, black and silent and watching. The clouds pressed low, thick with ice and intent, but Maya's eyes stayed on the radar, her fingers dancing along the interface like she could hear the plane whispering to her. "Echo wave system?" the captain asked, his voice thin with disbelief. "That hasn't been used in years." "It's the only thing not lying to us right now," she answered. He flipped a switch. The console flickered, groaned, then came to life, its grainy, old-school interface displaying a terrain map that looked primitive but reliable. The co-pilot exhaled softly, like someone who had been holding his breath for a long time without realizing. The cabin lights steadied. The altitude gauge began to stabilize. The turbulence slowed, not vanished but tamed, like a wild animal recognizing someone older and more dangerous. In the cabin, passengers clutched each other. Some sobbed, some closed their eyes, some stared at the cockpit door like it was the edge of a miracle. The man in the tracksuit said nothing now, only gripped his seat, his face pale and unreadable. The hedge fund executive sat stiffly, arms crossed, but his foot tapped nervously. An unconscious concession. The woman in the diamond earrings leaned over to a stranger and whispered, "What if she's actually military?" The stranger said nothing, only nodded slowly, like someone who had already begun rewriting the story in their head. Then Maya's voice came over the intercom, clear and calm. "This is passenger 8A. Controlled descent initiated. Stay seated. Remain calm." There was something in her voice, not command, not comfort, but the quiet certainty of someone who had walked through fire and now carried the weight of knowing exactly what to do when it burned again. The descent was not fast, it was intentional. The plane glided between two storm fronts, weaving through spaces that seemed impossible, like threading a thread through a needle mid-fall. The radar blinked, the mountain range fell away beneath them. Maya's hands did not tremble. The captain watched her for a long time before speaking. "She's handling this like it's a war zone." The co-pilot didn't answer. He just watched too. And in the moments that followed, as the nose of the aircraft began its final descent into stability, something unspoken filled the air. Not just relief, but reverence. Because no one could deny it now. The woman they had mocked, dismissed, warned, and silenced. She was saving them all. The plane leveled gently, almost reverently, as if the sky itself had relented under the steady hands of someone it had once tried to forget. In the cockpit, the last of the warning lights dimmed, replaced by the quiet hum of restored systems and the low, rhythmic blinking of stability. It felt less like a landing and more like forgiveness. Maya didn't speak much after that. Not to the captain, not to the co-pilot, not even when the airline radio buzzed again. This time with voices more civil, offering procedural acknowledgments and vague thanks laced with confusion and a hint of discomfort. She simply stayed focused, her fingers hovering lightly over the controls, not guarding them, not claiming them, just making sure they obeyed. Behind her, the co-pilot sat straighter now, the panic drained from his posture, replaced by the slow realization that he had just witnessed something that would not fit neatly into his training log. He looked at Maya once, long and unsure, before saying quietly, "You should have been up here from the start." Maya didn't turn. Her eyes remained on the sky ahead, a pale blue strip parting the last of the storm. "That would have cost us 2 minutes of argument," she said softly, "and a wing." She said it without venom, without bitterness. She wasn't looking to punish anyone. The point had already been made, not by her words, but by the silence that had followed them. Down in the cabin, the shift was more visible. The passengers were no longer loud, no longer smirking or snapping photos. There was a stiffness in their movements, the way people act after realizing they've misjudged someone in a way that cannot be undone. The man in the red tracksuit looked down at his hands resting on his knees as though waiting for them to apologize for him. The woman in the diamond earrings kept checking her phone, not for messages, there was no signal, but as a way to avoid looking up, as a way to not meet the gaze of the others around her. In the front row, the hedge fund executive rubbed his temples, the expensive metal of his watch glinting faintly in the overhead lights, as if even time now bore witness. A light attendant, not Jordan this time, but a younger one, nervous and kind, entered the cockpit with a clipboard trembling slightly in her hands. "Passengers," she stammered. "They're asking who she is. If they should be worried." She didn't say what they really meant. Should we trust her now, even though we didn't before? Maya didn't look away from the controls. "Tell them to stay seated and buckle up," she said. "The rest doesn't matter." The young woman hesitated, then nodded and backed out, her shoulders tense. Not from fear anymore, but from awe. And as the door closed again, sealing Maya inside the cockpit once more, she allowed herself one breath, just one, deep and deliberate. Not relief, not pride, just presence. Because it had never been about recognition, not about showing them who she was or proving she belonged. The truth was simpler, heavier. She had always known who she was. Their belief didn't add or subtract a single thing. Outside, the clouds parted, slow and solemn, and the sea below caught the light like it too, understood the weight of a second chance. Maya adjusted the descent vector slightly, her hand steady, her gaze unshaken, and somewhere far behind her, in the still cabin where shame sat side by side with gratitude. Someone finally whispered it aloud. She saved us, and she never even asked us to say thank you. The plane touched down at Narita Airport just after dusk, its tires kissing the runway with a grace that felt ceremonial. For a moment no one spoke, as if to exhale would betray the miracle of having arrived alive, of having passed through fire and landed softly on the other side. When the wheels stilled and the engines sighed into silence, the cabin erupted. Not wildly, not in screams or cheers, but in something quieter and heavier, clapping that began tentatively and then grew, joined by the sound of tears swallowed behind hands and the soft, stunned gasps of people realizing that what had happened was not routine, not explainable, not deserved, but real. Maya didn't linger. She removed the headset, unplugged the auxiliary cable, and rose from the seat without ceremony. The captain reached out, perhaps to thank her, perhaps to ask her name, but she was already moving, her steps light, the sound of her sneakers lost in the soft mechanical hum of shutdown sequences and whispered awe. By the time the doors opened, she was almost gone. Passengers filed out in small groups, some clinging to one another like their bond had been forged in something more sacred than shared travel plans. A child in row 12, a girl no older than 7, turned to her mother and whispered, "Was she a superhero?" The mother, exhausted and tearful, knelt to zip the girl's jacket and said, "No, baby, just someone who remembered what to do when no one else did." Outside the terminal, beneath the cold white lights and the shuffle of luggage wheels, Maya disappeared into the anonymity of movement. Her hoodie was up now, her bag slung casually over her shoulder, like it carried nothing but change for vending machines and a paperback half-read. She didn't check her phone. She didn't look back. She simply walked. At the airline press conference held later that week, a well-groomed spokesperson in a navy blazer stood behind a podium lined with microphones. "We are grateful for the safe outcome of Flight 472, he said, and commend our crew for their professionalism in unprecedented circumstances. A reporter from a Tokyo outlet raised her hand. "There are multiple reports that a female passenger assisted in the cockpit. Who was she?" The spokesman paused, his smile practiced, his response careful. "She was a passenger with prior experience," he said. "That's all we know at this time." The room murmured, unsatisfied. Back in Oregon, in a dusty auto shop tucked between a pawn shop and a shuttered diner, Maya wiped grease from her fingers as the radio played low. Classic rock, bleeding into a news bulletin. The president's voice crackled faintly through the static. "To the woman known only as Viper 8, this country owes you its gratitude. Even if we do not know your name, we know your courage." She didn't look up. She tightened the bolt on the carburetor and reached for a wrench. On her wrist, beneath a smudge of motor oil, the faint tattoo caught the flicker of fluorescent light. NV8, half faded but still legible. A secret never quite buried. The garage owner, a man with a limp and kind eyes, walked in, coffee in hand. "They're talking about you again," he said casually. "Some pilot who saved a plane? Pretty wild." Maya gave a small shrug, barely noticeable. "Sounds like quite a story," she said, tightening another bolt. And he, who had learned long ago not to ask more than what someone offered, only nodded. Elsewhere, the story spread. Blurry phone footage surfaced, Maya's silhouette in the cockpit, the side of her face lit by control panels, her voice calm over the intercom. It went viral, not because it was sensational, but because it felt true. The kind of truth people clung to when the world felt too sharp and shallow. The kind that whispered, "Look again." A teenage boy on the flight posted a video, just him, staring into the camera saying, "She didn't say a word to us, and we treated her like trash. But she saved us anyway." The comments flooded in. Strangers writing, "I've been her, I know that silence. We all owe someone like that." The woman in the diamond earrings deactivated her account. The man in the red tracksuit declined every interview request. The executive lost his board seat after a recording of his in-flight remarks surfaced. None of it was retribution. None of it came from Maya. The world simply responded the way a mirror reflects, even when no one's watching. In a modest living room in Fresno, the little girl who'd whispered about superheroes drew a picture with crayons. A woman in a hoodie flying a plane, the sky behind her split with lightning, the words, "Thank you," written in capital letters across the top. Her mother framed it. And far away in a church where stories of angels and quiet grace were told more through glances than sermons, an older woman held her rosary tighter and whispered, "I was on that flight. I judged her. I was wrong." Her confession didn't need forgiving, just remembering. They never learned her full name, but she stayed. Not in interviews or medals or parades, but in the moment before judgment, in the silence before apology, in the seat by the window where someone might now look twice before assuming